Good morning. Thank you all for having me here this morning. My name is Melanie Stansbury, as was said. I am a state house representative for the 28th House District for our State House of Representatives up in the Northeast Heights. So the district that I represent is essentially from Morrison, Wantabo to the very top of the mountain in Montgomery to Loma. So it's just a little slice of the heights. But of course, we work with the entire legislature and represent the entire state. My background, just to give you a little bit of background, I'm actually a water nerd, so I'm excited to be here to talk to you today about water legislation. So I work a lot as a consultant. I have my own consulting practice. Among other things, I work with Adrian Oglesby, who's also going to be presenting this morning with the Utton Center, and I work a lot with different nonprofit organizations and philanthropy to help advise on policy and nonprofit business management and how to really get programs going. And I work a lot on river restoration, water science, and the integration of those things into policy. So that is in particular why I was very interested in advancing water data policy in the legislature. And I want to give you all a little bit of an overview of what happened in the legislature. I'm sure all of you were following it very closely, but as it pertains to water and kind of what that means for the future going forward. So this legislative session, by all counts, was probably one of the most intense and productive legislative sessions ever in New Mexican history. There were 1,663 pieces of legislation introduced. That includes bills, memorials, joint resolutions, and things of that nature. And of those over 1,600 pieces of legislation, 309 of those were enacted, and 278, I believe, were actually signed into law. So it was a massive amount of work. It was a 60-day session. Nearly every single piece of legislation was heard in one or more committees, and it was like squeezing all of that into 2 months. Really had us there from morning till night, in some cases 7 days a week. Among the major pieces of legislation that passed that affect water and natural resources, I want to start with kind of the big bill, though it's not directly about water. I think it has implications of for water, and that's the Energy Transition Act, which is the ETA, as people are referring to it. It was a bill that combined a bunch of different elements, including economic development and ways for the utility to pay for its infrastructure costs down the road. But most importantly, it helps set New Mexico's goal for its utilities to be carbon-free by 2045, and PNM announced on Earth Day that they're actually going to try to move back that date to 2040. And that has implications for water consumption in New Mexico, because one of the largest water uses, particularly on the San Juan, is actually energy production, and so that could free up actually quite a lot of water that could be coming down into the Rio Grande system. So there's sort of interesting implications of that for water. There was also a Healthy Soils Bill enacted, which was in some senses an extension of some of the agricultural extension work that's already being done by our state ag folks and by our federal ag folks. But this is really a focus on how do we promote more soil sustainability and carbon capture and improvement of soil nutrients. There was also a bill, which I'm blanking on the name of it, but it was like the Fluid Oil and Gas Waste Bill, which will also have significant implications for water in New Mexico, because it essentially directs that water used in oil and gas fields be recycled before it's discharged. So right now we're seeing a huge boom in oil and gas development, particularly down in southeastern New Mexico, and it's using a tremendous amount of groundwater resources for the development of those oil and gas resources. And so this bill will help save literally billions and billions of gallons of water, fresh water in southeastern New Mexico. So that's a big deal. I would say, and I'm not just saying this because I was the sponsor of the bill, but because it was probably one of the more water-focused bills, probably the most significant water bill that passed the session was House Bill 651, which is the bill that I'm here to talk to you about today, which is called the Water Data Act. And this bill, I authored it, and it was co-sponsored by Gail Armstrong, who's the representative from Central New Mexico, who represents the New Mexico Tech area. She's from Magdalena. Derek Lente, who is from San Diego Pueblo, and chairman of the Water and Ag Committee, was another co-sponsor, and Nathan Small from Las Cruces, who also serves on Energy and Natural Resources, was another co-sponsor, and Antoinette Cedillo Lopez was our co-sponsor in the Senate. But the bill had tremendous bipartisan, cross-sectoral support across the board. It was passed in both the House and the Senate unanimously. And it had a lot of champions that were not actually on the bill, including Jack Chatfield from northeastern New Mexico, who's a rancher, Pat Woods, who's a senator, who's a rancher, who helped support the bill. So it was really a sort of all hands-on effort, and it was really, I think, impressive the way it moved so quickly. And I think what it really spoke to is that the one thing that we can all agree about in water is that we need more data. And it needs to be integrated, and it needs to be usable, and it needs to be put into tools that actually help us make decisions. And so the purpose of this act, it was based in many ways on language that had been piloted in California. You know, we often say here in New Mexico that we're a little behind the curve. We're now the top 2 in the nation. California is the only other state in the United States that's passed a Water Data Act. And it's something that people have been working on for years at the federal level and in different states, is to figure out how to put into place the enabling conditions to make sure that we can really integrate our data in an effective manner. So the bill was supported by the ag sector, oil and gas, the natural resources agencies, our irrigation districts, you name it, every sector, utilities, everybody supported this bill. So what the bill does is really put into place kind of the institutional framework for addressing our data problems. And I personally worked at the national level for a number of years. I'm a native New Mexican. I was born and raised here. I worked on acequia and tribal water issues for a number of years before moving to DC, where I worked at OMB in the White House, and I worked in the Senate Energy Committee, and I worked a lot on data policy. And one of the things we learned at the national level is that you really need directing agencies and providing a mandate to them that they make their data open, available, and interoperable, or else it always kind of falls to the bottom of the list of things that our scientists who are public servants have to do, because they're out there also doing their other jobs, whatever their mandates are. So there's a tremendous amount of data already out there. Probably every single one of your entities is collecting data in some format or form. But part of the challenge is that that data is not open, meaning it's not discoverable, it's not out on some sort of web resource or a place that can easily be found. It's not interoperable, meaning that especially with digitized data, there's a thing called metadata. I'm going to get real nerdy for a minute here about it to help understand what exactly this bill is trying to do and how the framework will be organized going forward. So in order to, for example, integrate stream flow data, you have to make sure that the data is collected at a comparable, say, timestamp, right? So that's part of the interoperability, is actually understanding the metadata of how the data was collected and making sure that it's curated in the way that it's made open so that scientists can actually integrate that data. So part of what you need in order to do that is to standardize data formats. And one of the areas that we've been hugely successful in doing that is in GIS. And I'll just tell a brief story because I think it really helps explain what we're trying to do here, because it's kind of abstract to wrap your mind around this if you don't work with these kind of data on a day-to-day basis. And that's a story that was told to me when I first started working for the federal government, working with the USGS. And that was that when September 11th happened, one of the huge challenges that happened in the emergency response in New York City immediately after the crash of the planes into the towers was that all of the geospatial data for where and how all of the infrastructure around those buildings had been built, where it was sited, how it worked together, was not in the same place. And literally, emergency responders had to go around from agency to agency to agency with CD-ROMs, because this was back then, and burn these geospatial data onto CD-ROMs and then bring them back to a centralized computer and try to build maps to understand where the subway lines were and the as-builts for the buildings. And even then, there was no standardization of the metadata, and so it was very difficult to figure out where everything was. So I think that's a really sort of tangible way to understand what we're talking about here. We have tons of data, but we don't have standards on how to kind of bring it together, and we don't have sort of standard platforms within which to bring it together to actually try to solve some big problems. So what the bill does, one of the things we learned at the federal government is that you need somebody to be in charge. And one of the things that's very challenging in water is that people don't like regulatory agencies, and they're always a little suspicious. So it's very important that you put somebody in charge that doesn't sort of have an interest in the outcome, right? So that's why we made the State Department of Geology the lead, because they are the scientists for the state. So state geology sits at New Mexico Tech. Our lead on this is going to be Stacy Timmons, as was mentioned. She is the head of the Groundwater Bureau for the Bureau of Geology, but she's one of our top, she hates when I call her a data scientist, she's one of our top water scientists who utilizes and understands data. And she is partnering with Lucia Sanchez, who is the lead within the Interstate Stream Commission for state water planning. And one of the big motivators of trying to push this bill forward now at this moment is, as you are all aware, I'm sure, last year the state undertook a state water planning process, and the #1 recommendation of the state water planning process was get our data act together. So this bill was to directly implement the recommendation of the state water plan, which was we need to get our water data situation together. So the bill essentially stands up a water data council. In the final hours of the legislature, it got majorly redrafted for reasons that are too expansive to explain here, but mostly political. But it kept the essence of what we were trying to do, which is to set up a state council of major water agencies that would start to convene and meet with stakeholders across the state to inventory data, to figure out what key data sets need to be curated, updated, made open, made available, and then start to figure out this question of interoperability and how do we start to build tools that bring this data together. Because at the end of the day, data is sort of like an endless hole of energy and resources in terms of curation. We're collecting data constantly. So you really need what many of my colleagues who work in this space call a use case. You need something that you're going to do with the data to really drive the activity. So the next step in implementing the bill is on Tuesday, the principals from the agencies that were directed by the bill to stand up this council are meeting here in Albuquerque. And the 5 agencies are the State Geology, Bureau of Geology, the Interstate Stream Commission, the Office of the State Engineer, New Mexico Environment Department, and Energy, Minerals, Natural Resources Department, so MNERD. And that doesn't preclude any other agencies, but those are the 5 sort of core agencies that will be convening on the state side.
No federal agencies, Melanie?
No, because this is state legislation, but the entire goal is to make the data interoperable with not only federal data, but also local and non-governmental data, frankly. So that's the council. Then on Wednesday, many of you have probably heard that there's going to be a meeting in Santa Fe, and Lucia Sanchez and Stacy Timmons have been helping to organize. They're going to bring many of our state's data experts together. WRI is helping do the convening, and they're going to start to go through the process of identifying what is our top use cases, what are the big problems we need to solve statewide, how should we focus this activity as a planning and management activity, what are our key data sets, how do we begin to address these questions of curation and interoperability. And in the next few months, the Bureau of Geology also was appropriated money to hire someone. And so they'll be hiring someone to help lead this activity. And in the coming year, they'll be reaching out to stakeholders all over the state to figure out how to actually implement it. So this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. You're not going to see a website tomorrow that, bam, makes all data available. This is like the hard stuff. This is the back end of actually making water data and tools. one of the things that I think especially as people who are leaders and working in your community, we're so accustomed nowadays of being able to use our smartphones to solve problems and provide, information to us instantly. And part of why we don't have those kinds of tools readily available in the water space is because the data is quite a mess. So part of what we have to do is get the data, the back end of the data, organized and put into formats and start to work with tool developers to develop more tools. So that's the purpose of the Water Data Act. And before I take questions, I just want to note a couple of other things that are going on in the water space, which I think will be of interest to you all. In addition, next week's kind of like Water Week for the state. In addition to the Water Data Act convenings that I mentioned, on Monday, the Bureau of Reclamation is convening people in Santa Fe to kick off the Rio Grande Basin study. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, it's a very exciting process. For a water data nerd. The federal government, under the Secure Water Act, has resources and technical capacity to help understand how climate change is going to affect different watersheds. So they downscale global climate models to specific watersheds to understand how that will affect water supply and demand. And then through the basin study process, working with stakeholders, they can actually identify how different kinds of interventions will help bring the system back into balance. So, for example, changes in flow regimes, or changes in storage, or changes in restoration, or creating new infrastructure. There's lots of different ways they can look at interventions. So the basin study process will kick off formally on Monday. The Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District and a number of nonprofit organizations in the city of Santa Fe are cost-share partners in that. And I think that will have a significant and beneficial impact on our communities going forward, and I really encourage folks to participate in that because that process will help identify how we address long-term water supply in the state. And it's not just like the state water plan, which is more of an inventory of kind of like what the needs are. This is like a quantitative hydrologic study of water balance in our system. So that's going to be really, really important. I'm not sure if Adrian will touch on this. Another effort that I think is great to be aware of is a group of nonprofit organizations have formed a coalition called Rios Unidos, which is looking at how to do statewide and basin-wide river restoration. It includes Trout Unlimited, the Yetton Center, Audubon, who else is that? The New Mexico Acequia Association, Rio Grande Restoration. It's a bunch of different nonprofits, and are beginning to think about how do we come together as a community to support system-wide restoration efforts. And so that's another exciting water thing that's going on. And then finally, I just want to say, in my capacity as a legislator, last night the Legislative Council just announced committee assignments. I will be serving on water and natural resources during the interim, and it looks like we're going to have a really exciting group of people serving. Senator Cervantes is chairing, and Derek Lente and Matthew McQueen are the vice co-chairs for the House side. And I'm really excited about this year and getting started on that. And my hope and intent during my tenure, I'm only obviously serving for 2 years at a time, but I would like to undertake a really significant effort to overhaul our state water policy and get as far as we can to really modernize things during my tenure. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do over the next year is to convene different stakeholders across the state and look at the water statutes that are already on the books and think about how can we really improve our management, how can we restructure the bureaucracy, how can we streamline this, how can we make it more effective and make it more 21st century, because we're one of the last states to not really modernize our bureaucracies, and I think it would function a lot better if we did. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and see if there's any questions, and just really thank you for your time, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much for that briefing. Exciting stuff.
Yeah. I will just say one of the things that's really neat is that just overnight, New Mexico kind of got on the map. And I have people from all over the country calling me right now saying what you guys are doing is really exciting in New Mexico. So we're in an exciting time.
Thanks for putting New Mexico out front for once.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are questions and comments from the board. I see Don, you had your hand up. And
I just wanted to make a little observation. I met with Mike Hammond, the head of the MRGCD, about 3 weeks ago, and he said that this is going to be a good water year. 135% of normal is what he said. And he said there will be over 1 million acre-feet passing through the bridge this year. That has not happened in a long time. And so that's the kind of data, historical and also current, that should be out there. It should be out there for people to understand, because that's a barometer. That is a real barometer of how good a year you're going to have and how bad the years have been. I'm just throwing that out.
Yeah. So one of the things that is really challenging and why I'm excited about this basin study in particular is that what we've been seeing even over the last several years here in New Mexico is these huge swings. So many people don't realize that last year was one of the worst drought times for our state because it was actually raining here in Albuquerque, but our reservoirs were like on empty. And that was because we didn't have good snowpack the last winter. And this year we have great snowpack, and that is actually one of the signature sort of calling cards of global climate change, are these big oscillations and irregularities. And one of the challenges for us is that we don't have data and models for which to plan our infrastructure and flows around huge oscillations. We've planned for more stability in our system, and so understanding these huge changes is going to be really critical going forward. So, yeah.
The council meetings for the data council, are they open to the public? And if so, how do you find them?
So they're just getting started next week, and so I'm not sure how it's all going to be set up. But I will report out to you, and I'll make sure that Stacy and Lucia send out information once they've figured it out. So we're literally just trying to figure it out as we go right now. Yeah.
Melanie, I think this is wonderful, but one of the problems is that it takes a lot of money to do this. It's very ambitious.
Yeah.
Does the legislation include funding?
Yes. So the original piece of legislation included, actually I'm very excited that you asked this question because we recognized this when we drafted the legislation. You need humans to do the work. The agencies need to staff it within their own agencies because they're the ones with the data. But you also need resources to actually do the data curation and integration and the tech services and all that stuff. So this session, we were not able to get a big chunk of the sort of other piece of money appropriated, but we were able to get staff for the Bureau of Geology to implement it, and I hope commitments from the agencies to staff it from the inside. But what we did provide in the legislation is a fund that will sit technically at the Bureau of Geology, and we have a huge interest from philanthropy right now in helping to provide additional resources. So there is an organization called the Internet of Water that has been stood up at Duke, and they have resources that came from Bechtel and other national foundations through the Water Funder Initiative, and they're actually flying their team out next week to begin to work with us to figure out how to implement the bill. And potentially we also have folks from the Water Foundation interested in helping to support and move things along. So it will be a multi-tiered, multi-layered effort. It can't be done by the state alone. There are not enough resources in the world to ever curate all the data that's out there. But it will also be a stepwise process. So this year is going to be all about inventorying, setting up the structure, figuring out what our use case is, and then in the out years, that's when we're going to need to start bringing in larger resources to start building these tools, and exactly as you're noting. But I think that the groundwork has been laid to bring those resources in, so it is exciting.
Other questions? Other comments? Oh, yeah, Elaine.
Well, thank you. This group may remember that a year ago, we set up a little committee to start looking at implementing a water database on a regional basis. Don Lopez and Brenda Smythe and Pat Clouser were on that. And, sorry, Mr. Ferris. But we quickly found that it was bigger than we sort of could handle. And we talked, I think Don talked with Sam Fernald. We had a meeting there at the Weary Conference at the end talking about data. So this is, I'm really excited to see this. I hope that in this exchange, and I'm looking at section C, section 3C, agencies shall collaborate with other regional and national efforts to share. And I'm thinking that it would be good to have a representative from here on that committee so that there is that exchange, because then the regional effort doesn't go sideways from the state effort. And also asking the questions for what data is needed and collected and setting those standards here as well as at that state level. I think I too am really excited about it, but I think that it was the top thing for this region's plan that we hadn't tackled from the 2004 plan was the database. And so it's not just the state, but it's also in our regional plan that is a real big priority. Yesterday, by the way, the USGS released a new report on water levels in the trend, and they include their whole section on metadata. And so they actually go through what that includes, and I think it might be a useful example. Thanks.
I really appreciate that feedback, and I think that the meeting on Wednesday, in part, and going back to some of the other questions, is meant to sort of have the discussion about how do we create a structure that can have, integration with efforts across the state. We are fortunate to be the second after California because we get to learn from California about how they tried to launch their data initiative. And one of the challenges is that we've got the federal government collecting all its data, you've got the state agencies collecting their data, utilities, the irrigation districts. There's so many layers, right? And so there's not going to be one single platform, one single tool that will answer all questions, which I think everyone wishes there would be. But the question is, how do we make the data open and available in the key ways so that when the Middle Rio Grande develops a tool or set of tools, the data can easily be pulled into that? And are there resources, to the resource question, so that in a few years when you guys are ready to build whatever tool it is, or set of tools, that hopefully the state can help support that in some way and help support the development out of those decision support tools. So these are all critical questions, but unanswered at the moment. But I think we're well on our way. And if you consider that a year ago we weren't even on our way yet, we're one step closer to helping to answer these questions. Yeah.
Also, anything about the advanced mapping fund?
That did pass.
Yeah.
And so there was a bill that it had previously passed the legislature a number of times, I think, actually, that would set up an advanced mapping fund to use tools like LIDAR and ISAR, I believe, to do aquifer mapping. Passed the legislature. I'll ask Stacy, but I'm not sure where they are in implementation on that. But the bill passed early, and it was one of the first bills that the governor signed into law this session.
But it helps the state engineer. That's the point.
Yeah, it'll help every agency for sure. Yeah. Other questions?
Well, I'd like to thank you again, and congratulations on both
Thank you.
becoming a representative and getting this amazing bill through the governor's office. And I'd just like to state that in my years in the water field, I've frequently observed the disconnect between the quantity issues and the quality issues. And I think this initiative provides an opportunity for those two things to be more well connected, as you will, because they're definitely interrelated, and often that interrelationship isn't addressed. So I'm hoping that that's an objective of this initiative. So
Absolutely.
thank you again for coming today. I know we have to be somewhere by 11, so we will
I'll leave
turn you loose.
I'll leave a stack of cards here. I don't have very many, but if you would like to get in contact with me, please take a card, and I look forward to working with you all. Thank you for having me this morning.
Thank you much. Director,